Hello, and welcome to Captain Party's Story Time. This is a special bedtime story segment. Well, we'll be reading a short story called The Moon Ribbon. It's a very good story. Mm-mm. Okay. There was once a plain but good-hearted girl named Silva, whose sole possession was a ribbon her mother had left her. It was a strange ribbon, the color of moonlight, for it had been woven from the gray hairs of her mother and her mother's mother and her mother's mother's mother before her. Silva lived in her widowed father with her widowed father in a great house by the forest's edge. Once the great house had belonged to her mother, but when she died, it became Silva's father's house to do with as he willed. And what he willed was to live simply and happily with his daughter without thinking of the day to come. But one day, when there was little enough left to live on, and only the great house to recommend him, Silva's father married again. A beautiful widow who had two beautiful daughters of her own. And it was a disastrous choice, for no sooner were they wed, when it was apparent that the woman was mean in spirit, and even meaner in tongue. And she dismissed most of the servants, and gave their chores to Silva, who followed her orders without complaint. For simply living in her mother's house with her loving father seemed enough for the girl. But after a bit, however, the old man died in order to have some peace, and the house passed on to the stepmother. And scarcely 2 days had passed, or maybe 3, when the stepmother left off mourning the old man and turned on Silva. She dismissed the last of the servants without their pay. "Girl," she called out, for she never used Silva's name, "you will sleep in the kitchen and do the charring." And from that time on it was so. And Silva swept the floor and washed and mended the family's clothing, and she sowed and hoed and tended the fields. And she ground the wheat and she kneaded the bread, and she waited on the others as though she were a servant, but she did not complain. And yet late at night, when Silva's stepmother, and her own 2 daughters were asleep, Silva would weep bitterly into her pillow, which was nothing more than an old broom laid on the front of the hearth. And one day, when she was cleaning out the old desk, Silva came upon a hidden drawer that she had never seen before. Trembling, she opened the drawer, and it was empty except for a silver ribbon with a label attached to it. For Silva, read the card, the moon ribbon of her mother's hair. And she took it out and she stared at it, and all that she had lost was borne in upon her, and she felt the tears start in her eyes, and so as not to cry, she took the tag off and began to stroke the ribbon with her hand. And it was rough and smooth at once, and shone like all the rays of the moon. And at that moment her stepsisters came into the room. "What is that?" asked one. "Is it nice?" "Ooh, it's mine. I want it. I saw it first," cried the other. And the noise brought the stepmother to them. "Show it to me," she said. And obediently Silva came over and held the ribbon out to her. But when the stepmother picked it up, it looked like no more than a strand of gray woven hair, tied together unevenly. It was prickly to the touch. "Disgusting," the stepmother said, dropping it back into Silva's hand. "Throw it out at once." "Burn it," cried one stepsister. "Bury it," cried the other. "Oh, please, it was my mother's, and she left it for me. Please let me keep it," begged Silva. And the stepmother looked again at the gray strand. "Very well," she said with a grim smile. "It suits you." And she strode out of the room, and her daughters went behind her. Now that she had the silver ribbon, Silva thought maybe her life would be better, but instead it just became worse. And as if to punish her for speaking out for the ribbon, her sisters were at her to wait on them both day and night. And whereas before she had to sleep by the hearth, now she had to sleep outside with the animals. Yet she did not complain or run away, for she was tied by her memories to her mother's house. And one night, when the frost was on the grass, turning each blade into a silver spear, Silva threw herself on the ground in tears, and the silver ribbon which she had tied loosely about her hair slipped off and lay on the ground before her. She had never seen it in the moonlight, and it glittered and shone, and it seemed to ripple. Silva bent over to touch it, and her tears fell upon it, and suddenly the ribbon began to grow and change. And as it changed, the air was filled with a woman's soft voice speaking these words: "Silver ribbon, silver hair, carry Silva with great care. Bring my daughter home. And there at Silva's feet was a silver river that glittered and shone and rippled in the moonlight. And there was neither a boat nor bridge, but Silva did not care, and she thought the river would wash away her sorrows, and without a single word she threw herself in. But she did not sink. Instead she floated like a swan, and the river bore her on, past houses and hills, and past high places and low, and strange to say, she was not wet at all. And she was carried around a great bend in the river and deposited gently on a grassy slope that came right down to the water's edge. Silva scrambled up onto the banks and looked about. There was a great meadow of grass so green and still that it might have been painted on, and at the meadow's rim, near a dark forest, sat a house that was like and yet not like the one in which Silva lived now. Surely someone will be there who can tell me where I am, she thought. So she made her way across the meadow, and only where she stepped down did the grass move. And when she moved beyond, the grass sprang back, and was the same as before. And though she passed larkspur and meadowsweet and clover and rye, they did not seem like real flowers, for they had no smell at all. Am I dreaming, she wondered, or am I dead? But she did not say it out loud, for she was afraid to speak into the silence. Silva walked up to the house and hesitated at the door. She feared to knock, and yet she feared equally not to. And as she was deciding, the door opened itself, of its own accord, and she walked in. And she found herself in a large, long, dark hall with a single crystal door at the end. And it emitted a strange glow, the color of moonlight. And as she walked down the hall, her shoes made no clatter on the polished wood floor. And when she reached the door, she tried to peer through it into the room beyond. But the crystal panes merely gave back her own reflection 12 times. And Silva reached for the doorknob and pulled sharply. And the glowing crystal knob came off in her hand. And she would have wept then, but anger stayed her, and she beat her fist against the door, and it suddenly gave way. And inside was a small room lit by a fireplace and a round white globe that hung from the ceiling like a pale wan moon. And before the fireplace stood a tall woman dressed all in white, and her silver white hair was unbound and cascaded to her knees, and around her neck was a silver ribbon. "Welcome, my daughter," she said. "Are you my mother?" asked Silva wonderingly, for what little she remembered of her mother she remembered no one as grand as this. "I am if you make me so," came the reply. "And how do I do that?" asked Silva. "Give me your hand." And as the woman spoke she seemed to move away, and yet she moved not at all, and instead the floor between them moved and cracked apart, and soon they were separated by a great chasm, which was so black it seemed to have no bottom. "I cannot reach," said Silva. "You must try," the woman replied. So Silva clutched the crystal knob to her breast, and she leapt. But it was too far, and as she fell she heard a woman's voice speaking from behind her, and before her and all about her was warm praise. "Well done, my daughter. You are halfway home." And Silva landed gently on the meadow grass, but only a moment's walk from her house. And in her hand she still held the knob, shrunk now to the size of a jewel. And the river shimmered once before her, and it was gone. And where it had been was a silver ribbon lying limp and damp in the forest frost. And the door in the house stood open, and she drew a deep breath and went in. "What is that?" cried one of the stepsisters when she saw the crystal and jewel in Silva's hand. "I want it," cried the other, grabbing it from her. "I will take that," said the stepmother, snatching it from them all. And she held it up to the light and examined it. "Oh, it will fetch a good price and repay me for my care of you. Where did you get it?" she asked Silva. Silva tried to tell them of the ribbon and the river and the tall woman and the black crevasse, but they laughed at her and did not believe her. And yet they could not explain away the jewel. So they left her, and then they went off to the city to sell it. And when they returned it was late, and they thrust Silva outside to sleep, and went themselves to their comfortable beds to dream of their new riches. And Silva sat on the cold ground and thought about what had happened. And she reached up and she took down the ribbon from her hair and she stroked it and she felt it felt smooth and soft and yet hard too. And carefully she placed it on the ground. In the moonlight, the ribbon glittered and shone. Silva recalled the song she had heard, so she sang it to herself. Silver ribbon, silver hair, carry Silva with great care. Bring my daughter home. And suddenly the ribbon began to grow and to change, and there at her feet was a silver highway that glittered and glistened in the moonlight. And without a moment's hesitation, Silva got up and stepped onto the road and waited for it to bring her to the magical house. But the road did not move. Strange, she said to herself, why does it not carry me as the river did? So Silva stood on the road and waited a moment more, and then tentatively she set one foot on front of the other, and soon, as she set off down on her own, the road set off too, and they moved together past fields and forests faster and faster, till the scenery seemed to fly by and blur into a moon-bleached rainbow of yellows and grays and blacks. And the road took a great turning, and then quite suddenly it stopped. But Silva did not. She scrambled up the bank where the road ended and found herself again in a meadow. The far rim of the grass, where the forest began, was the house she had seen before. Silva strode purposefully through the grass, and this time the meadow was filled with the songs of birds, and meadowlark and bunting, and sweet jug-jug and nightingale, and she could smell fresh mown hay and pungent pine. And the door to the house stood wide open, so Silva went right in, and the long hall was no longer dark, but filled with strange moon-glow. And when she reached the crystal door at the end and gazed at her own reflection 12 times in the glass, she saw her own face, set with strange gray eyes and long gray hair, and she put her hand up to her mouth to stop herself from crying out, but the sound came through, and the door opened itself. And inside was a tall woman all in white, and the globe above her was bright as the harvest moon. "Welcome, my sister," the woman said. "But I have no sister," said Silva, "but the 2 stepsisters I have left at home, and you are none of those." "I am if you make me so." "Well, how do I do that?" "Give me back my heart, which you took from me yesterday." "I did not take your heart, I took nothing but a crystal jewel." And the woman smiled. "That was my heart." And Silva looked stricken. "But I cannot give it back. My stepmother took it from me." "No one can take anything unless you give it." "I had no choice." "There is always a choice," the woman said. Silva would have cried then, but a sudden thought struck her. "And then it must have been your choice to give me your heart," she said. And the woman smiled again, and nodded gently, and she held out her hand. And Silva placed her hand in the woman's, and there it glowed for a moment on the woman's breast, a silvery jewel that melted and disappeared. "Now will you give me your heart?" "I have done that already," said Silva. When she said it, she knew that it was true. And the woman reached over and touched Silva on her breast, and her heart sprang out into the woman's hand, and it turned into 2 fiery jewels. "Once given, twice gained," said the woman, and she handed one of the jewels back to Silva. Only take care that you give each jewel with love." And Silva felt the jewel warm and glowing in her hand, and at its touch she felt such comfort as she had not known in many days. And she closed her eyes, and a smile came on her face. And when she opened her eyes again, she was standing in the meadow grass, not 2 steps away from her own door. And it was morning, and by her feet lay the silver ribbon, limp and damp from the frost. And the door to her house stood open. Silva drew in a breath and picked up the ribbon and went in. "What has happened to your hair?" asked the stepsister. "What has happened to your eyes?" asked the other. And for indeed Silva's hair and eyes had turned as silver as the moon. But the stepmother saw only the fiery red jewel in Silva's hand. "Give it to me," she said, pointing to the gem. And at first Silva held out her hand, but then quickly she drew it back. "I cannot," she said, and the stepmother's eyes became hard. "Girl, you give it here." I will not, said Silva, and the stepmother's eyes narrowed. Then you shall tell me where you got it. That I shall, and gladly, said Silva. And she told them of the silver ribbon and the silver road, and of the house with the crystal door. But strange to say, she left the woman out and her words. And the stepmother closed her eyes and thought. At last, she said, let me see this wondrous silver ribbon, that I may believe what you say. And Silva handed her the ribbon, but she was not fooled by her stepmother's tone. Oh, the moment the silver ribbon lay prickly and limp in the stepmother's hand, she looked at it triumphantly, and at Silva, and her face broke into a wolfish grin. Fools, she said, the magic is herein, and with this ribbon there are jewels for the taking. And she marched out of the door, and the stepsisters hurried behind her. And Silva walked after them, but slowly stopping in the open door. And the stepmother flung the ribbon down, and in the early morning sun it glowed as if with a cold flame. Say the words, girl, the stepmother commanded from the doorway, and Silva whispered, silver ribbon, silver hair, lead the ladies with great care, lead them to their home. And the silver ribbon wiggled and writhed in the sunlight, and as they watched it turned into a silver red staircase that went down into the ground. Wait, called Silva, do not go in there. But it was too late. With a great shout, the stepmother gathered up her skirts and ran down the steps, and her daughters fast behind her. And before Silva could move, the ground had closed up after them, and the meadow was as it was before. On the grass lay the silver ribbon, limp and dull, and Silva went over and picked it up. And as she did so, the jewel melted in her hand, and she felt a burning in her breast. And she put her hand up to it, and she felt her heart beating strongly beneath. And Silva smiled, and she put the silver ribbon in her pocket, and she went back into her house. And after a time, Silva's hair returned to its own color, except for 7 silver strands. But her eyes never changed back, and when she was married and had a child of her own, Silva plucked the silver strands from her own hair, and she wove them into a silver ribbon, which she kept in a wooden box. And when Silva's child was old enough to understand, the box with the ribbon was put into her safekeeping, and she has kept them for her own daughter to this very day. Well, that was our Captain Party bedtime story, The Moon Ribbon, and I hope you enjoyed it, because I really like it. All right, well, have a good evening, everyone. Daytime, afternoon, morning time, whatever it is. Um, See you next time.